He lost $20 million in less than 10 minutes. Not to bad investments, not to crime, but to the woman he trusted most and the lawyer she was secretly sleeping with. One courtroom, one signature. And suddenly the life he had built over 2 decades was no longer his. The judge called it legal. His wife called it fair. But as he stood alone that night, staring at an empty apartment stripped down to bare walls, one truth burned through him. This was not justice. It was a perfectly planned theft. What no one knew and she never imagined was that long before the marriage, long before the betrayal, his grandfather had left behind something forgotten. A financial shadow from 1990. A silent account that would change everything. Before we dive into this story, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you're drawn to powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The night he lost everything, the city outside his window kept breathing as if nothing had happened. Cars slid through wet asphalt. Lights flickered in distant apartments. Somewhere, laughter echoed from a bar downstairs. And yet inside the half-empty penthouse, Julian Crow stood perfectly still, holding a single envelope that had just ended his life as he knew it. $20 million. Gone. Not stolen in the dark. Not lost to fraudsters or reckless deals. Taken cleanly, calmly, and legally by the woman who had once pressed her forehead to his chest and promised she would never hurt him. And by the man she had secretly been sleeping with while pretending to defend their marriage in court. The judge's voice still rang in Julian's ears, detached and final. Assets divided. Accounts transferred. Motion granted. Gavel struck. 10 minutes of procedure erased 20 years of work. They called it fair. Julian called it execution. He loosened his tie with shaking fingers and let it fall to the floor. The apartment felt cavernous, now stripped of warmth. The artwork was gone. The furniture that had legally belonged to his wife had been removed while he sat in meetings trying to save the marriage. What remained were pale walls, a glass table, and silence so thick it pressed against his chest. Earlier that day, he had walked into the courtroom believing facts would protect him. Numbers always had. He believed contracts mattered. He believed the truth had weight. He had been wrong. Across the aisle, his wife had never once looked at him. She sat straight-backed, dressed in soft cream tones, eyes glistening just enough to suggest pain without ever crossing into weakness. Beside her stood her attorney, polished, confident, and devastatingly calm. The same man who had smiled at Julian during dinners. The same man who had shaken his hand and said, "I'll take good care of both of you." That lie had cost Julian $20 million. And his dignity. When the verdict was read, Julian felt something inside him collapse, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a structure failing beyond repair. He had not shouted. He had not begged. He had simply nodded because somewhere deep inside, he already knew the system had chosen its side, long before he entered the room. Now, hours later, the envelope in his hand confirmed it. Final statements, frozen accounts, official notices stamped with authority. Each page felt heavier than the last. Julian dropped them onto the glass table and sank into a chair, staring at his reflection in the dark window. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, slumped under a weight that had nothing to do with money. $20 million wasn't just wealth. It was proof of every risk he had taken. Every sleepless night. Every time he chose responsibility over comfort. And now it belonged to someone who had planned his downfall with a smile. The injustice of it burned. But worse than the loss was the precision. The way everything had been arranged so perfectly that resistance felt impossible. Dates, documents, witnesses, expert testimony that somehow painted him as the aggressor, the hoarder, the man who needed to be balanced. Julian let out a hollow laugh. Balanced. That word echoed bitterly. He stood and walked toward the bedroom where only one closet remained untouched. Inside, a few old boxes sat stacked against the wall, things he had never bothered to unpack after moving in. Memories without market value, papers too old to matter. At least, that was what he'd always believed. He knelt and opened the top box more to occupy his hands than out of curiosity. Inside were yellowed notebooks, faded photographs, and a leather folder worn thin at the edges. The scent of dust and age rose into the air. His grandfather's things. Julian froze. He hadn't thought about the old man in years. A quiet presence in his childhood. Sharp-eyed, careful. The kind of man who spoke rarely but remembered everything. He had taught Julian to respect money, not as power, but as responsibility. One memory surfaced uninvited. They were sitting at a kitchen table decades ago. Julian was young, impatient, full of questions. His grandfather had tapped the table once and said almost casually, "The most important accounts are the ones no one is looking at." At the time, Julian had laughed it off, assuming it was another lesson wrapped in metaphor. Now, with his life in ruins, the words felt different. He opened the leather folder. Inside were handwritten notes, bank names that no longer existed, dates from the late 1980s and early 1990s, account numbers partially crossed out. Nothing that looked immediately useful, nothing that would impress a judge or scare a lawyer. And yet Julian felt his pulse quicken. Why would his grandfather keep records this carefully? Why save them at all? Julian sat back on his heels, the folder resting in his hands. The room around him faded as a realization began to form, not fully, not clearly, but enough to disturb the certainty of defeat that had settled over him hours earlier. What if everything wasn't gone? What if the people who thought they had won had only taken what they could see? He closed the folder slowly, his mind racing for the first time since the verdict. A strange calm replaced the shock. Not hope, not yet, but something sharper. Awareness. The story wasn't over. And before we go any further, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Stories like this reach people all over the world, and I'd love to know where you're listening from. And if you're drawn to powerful stories of betrayal, hidden truth, and unexpected justice, make sure you subscribe, because what comes next will change everything. Julian stood the folder tucked under his arm and looked once more at the empty apartment. For the first time that night, he didn't feel small inside it. Somewhere in the past, something had been left behind, and it was waiting. Long before the courtroom stripped him bare, Julian Crow had been a man people trusted without question. He wasn't born into wealth. No silver spoon, no safety net. His childhood had been modest, shaped by discipline more than comfort, and by a grandfather who believed that stability was built quietly brick by brick, long before anyone noticed the structure rising. Julian learned early that money didn't announce itself. It accumulated in patience, in restraint, in decisions made when no one was watching. While other children dreamed of fame or luxury, he absorbed lessons about risk timing and silence. His grandfather never bragged, never chased trends. He simply watched the world carefully and taught Julian to do the same. That mindset followed Julian into adulthood. By his early 30s, he had built a reputation as a man who delivered results without drama. He worked in private equity, moving through deals most people never heard about, growing capital for clients who valued discretion over headlines. He dressed simply. He spoke softly. And because of that, people underestimated him. Julian didn't correct them. When he met Evelyn Hart, it felt like the one part of his life that didn't require strategy. She was intelligent, articulate, and effortlessly warm. Where Julian was reserved, Evelyn was expressive. Where he calculated, she felt. Together they looked balanced, at least from the outside. Friends praised their chemistry. Colleagues admired her ability to soften him. Even Julian's grandfather, already frail by then, had smiled quietly when he met her. That approval mattered more to Julian than he admitted. The early years of their marriage were calm, comfortable. Julian worked long hours, yes, but Evelyn never complained. She hosted dinners, remembered birthdays, supported his ambitions with what seemed like genuine pride. When Julian spoke about numbers or markets, she listened even when she didn't fully understand. Or so he thought. The wealth came gradually. One successful deal led to another. Julian reinvested, diversified, protected. By the time they moved into the penthouse overlooking the river, the number attached to his name had crossed 8 figures. Still, he lived like a man, with half that amount. Evelyn, however, began to change. At first, it was subtle. A new interest in luxury brands, casual remarks about friends who lived better, questions about why certain funds were structured the way they were. Julian answered patiently, assuming curiosity was natural. He didn't notice how often she asked about ownership. He didn't notice how her questions shifted from, "How does this work?" to, "What would happen if?" Julian trusted systems. He trusted contracts. And most of all, he trusted the woman who slept beside him every night. That trust was his blind spot. When Evelyn suggested they consult a lawyer just to update documents, Julian agreed without hesitation. He saw it as responsible housekeeping, estate planning, protection, nothing more. That was when Marcus Hale entered their lives. Marcus was everything Julian was not: charismatic, sharply dressed, and relentlessly confident. He spoke with certainty even when the facts were thin, and people responded to that. Julian noticed the way Marcus looked at Evelyn when he thought no one was paying attention. But he dismissed it as ego. Lawyers thrived on attention. Marcus framed every suggestion as protection, safeguards, just in case. He reassured Julian that nothing would change, that these were standard procedures for high-net-worth couples. Julian signed where he was told, reviewed summaries instead of full clauses. He had meetings to attend, deals to close. He trusted that the system and his marriage were solid. The truth was, the trap was already being built. Evelyn became more distant, more private. She started taking calls in other rooms. She traveled more frequently, often citing stress or needing space. Julian felt the shift but struggled to name it. When he asked, she accused him of being paranoid, of letting work make him insecure. He apologized. That was the pattern. Every time he sensed something wrong, he was made to feel guilty for noticing. Julian's friends saw the cracks before he did. One colleague warned him that Marcus Hale had a reputation: quiet scandals, questionable ethics settlements, buried under confidentiality clauses. Julian listened politely and filed it away, unwilling to believe his life could unravel so easily. He told himself he was overthinking. The divorce filing came on a Tuesday morning. No warning. No conversation. Just papers delivered to his office, outlining claims that painted him as controlling, financially abusive, emotionally distant. Allegations that shocked him with their creativity. Evelyn had prepared for months. Marcus had prepared longer. Julian's first instinct was disbelief. The second was confidence. The truth would prevail. Records would protect him. Judges valued facts. He underestimated how powerful a story could be when told by the right voice. In court, Evelyn cried on cue. She spoke of fear, of manipulation, of feeling trapped by money she never had access to. Marcus framed Julian as a cold architect of wealth who used complexity to dominate. Julian watched his life distorted into a narrative he barely recognized. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. Every safeguard he thought protected him had been reframed as evidence against him. Every signature he gave freely became money leverage. The system he trusted rewarded preparation, not honesty. And when the gavel fell, Julian understood something with terrifying clarity. He had not lost because he was wrong. He had lost because he was naive. That night alone in the empty penthouse, Julian finally accepted the truth he had avoided for years. Success had made him efficient, but not vigilant. He had protected assets, but not intent. Structures, but not people. As he sat on the floor with his grandfather's old folder in his hands, he realized how far he had drifted from the lessons that built him. The old man had always warned him, trust should never be blind. Julian closed his eyes, breathing slowly, grounding himself in the silence. The anger was there, the grief, the humiliation. But beneath it all, something else stirred resolve. The man who built $20 million from nothing had not disappeared. He had simply been waiting to remember who he was. In the weeks leading up to the divorce filing, the warning signs had been everywhere. Julian saw them now with brutal clarity, like footprints revealed only after the storm had passed. Evelyn stopped asking about his day. Not gradually, suddenly. Conversations that once lingered over dinner became clipped exchanges about schedules and errands. She kept her phone face down on the table, silenced. When it buzzed, she would glance at the screen, tighten her jaw for half a second, then excuse herself to take the call in another room. Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. But he told himself stories to explain it away. She's stressed. She feels neglected. This is what long marriages go through. Each explanation was easier than confronting the possibility that the foundation beneath him was already cracking. The lawyer meetings increased. What began as quarterly check-ins became weekly consultations. Evelyn framed them as necessary just updates, just clarifications. Marcus Hale's name surfaced, constantly spoken with a familiarity that made Julian uncomfortable without quite knowing why. When Julian finally met Marcus alone for the first time, the man greeted him with an easy smile and a handshake that lingered half a second too long. "You're lucky," Marcus said casually. "Most people with your portfolio wait too long to get things in order." Julian nodded, uneasy. "I like to stay ahead of problems." Marcus's eyes flicked up sharp. Smart men always do. At the time, Julian took it as a flattery. In hindsight, it felt like measurement. Evelyn began to dress differently. Sharper lines, softer fabrics, a subtle shift that suggested intention rather than comfort. She laughed more freely, but not with him. When Julian touched her, she stiffened slightly before relaxing, as if reminding herself to perform. The first real crack came late one night. Julian had woken to the glow of light in the hallway. Evelyn's voice carried faintly from the study, low, urgent. He stood in the dark, listening not because he wanted to spy, but because something in her tone felt unfamiliar. Intimate, controlled. "No, I told you not yet," she whispered. "He's not ready." A pause. "Yes, I understand. But the timing has to be right." Julian stepped back before the floor could betray him. His heart hammered, not with certainty, but with dread. When Evelyn returned to bed minutes later, she kissed his cheek and told him she was just talking to a friend. Julian didn't sleep. The next morning, he asked her directly if something was wrong. She laughed, light, almost amused, and accused him of projecting his work anxiety onto her. She reminded him of all the sacrifices she'd made, all the nights she'd been alone while he chased deals. By the end of the conversation, Julian was apologizing. That was when he began to doubt himself. Gaslighting didn't come as cruelty. It came wrapped in affection, in concern, in practiced disappointment. Every question Julian raised was turned back on him. Every instinct was framed as insecurity. Marcus encouraged this. In meetings, he spoke to Julian like a guide, calming an irrational client. He reassured him that emotional turbulence was common, that divorce proceedings, if they ever came to that, were nothing to fear. "If there's nothing to hide," Marcus said once, smiling thinly, transparency only helps. Julian agreed. He always agreed. The affair revealed itself not through passion, but through carelessness. Julian found the receipt by accident dinner for two at a restaurant they used to love, on a night Evelyn claimed she was visiting her sister. The handwriting on the signature line wasn't his. He stared at it longer than necessary, as if the ink might rearrange itself into a better explanation. When he confronted her, Evelyn didn't deny it. She sighed, sat down, folded her hands, and told him it was his fault. She said she had felt invisible for years, that Marcus listened, that Marcus understood her, that Julian had chosen money over marriage control, over love. She said the affair was a symptom, not a betrayal. Julian felt the room tilt. He asked if she loved Marcus. She didn't answer. That silence hurt more than any confession could have. Days later, Marcus appeared not as a lover, but as a shield. He framed the affair as irrelevant. He redirected conversations toward healthy separation and equitable distribution. He spoke of fairness, while quietly positioning himself between Julian and any attempt at reconciliation. Betrayal was no longer just personal, it was procedural. Julian's attorney warned him that the optics were bad, that Evelyn's narrative was gaining traction, that Marcus's involvement presented a conflict of interest, but one that would be difficult to prove without evidence. Evidence Julian didn't have. By the time the divorce papers arrived, Julian felt like he was already on trial. The language was surgical. Every word chosen to provoke sympathy. Every allegation designed to paint him as powerful, detached, and dangerous in subtle ways. Marcus had transformed complexity into suspicion. Julian's defenses were rational, logical, incomplete. The court didn't care how Julian felt. It cared how the story landed. And the story had been written long before Julian realized he was a character in it. As the days passed, something hardened inside him. Not anger yet, awareness. He replayed conversations, re-examined documents, noticed patterns he had ignored. Marcus had always pushed for urgency. Evelyn had always steered discussions away from specifics. Together, they had controlled the tempo until Julian was reacting instead of thinking. By the time he understood, the machine was already moving. And still, even as the weight of it pressed down on him, Julian couldn't accept the finality of it all. Not completely. There was a voice, quiet but persistent, that refused to believe his entire life had been dismantled so easily. That voice sounded like his grandfather. The old man had always warned him about smooth talkers, about people who smiled too easily while rearranging the board. "Watch what people rush you through," he used to say. That's where the trick is. Julian had forgotten that. Now, standing in the ruins of his marriage, he remembered. And he began to understand that betrayal wasn't just about infidelity or stolen money. It was about misdirection, about being made to look one way while the real movement happened elsewhere. Julian didn't yet know how to fight back. But he knew one thing with certainty. The story he had been fed was not the whole truth. And somewhere buried under years of trust and neglect was the missing piece that would expose it. The confrontation did not happen the way Julian had imagined it would. There was no shouting, no shattered glass, no dramatic confession under bright lights. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, with sunlight spilling across the living room floor and the sound of traffic drifting lazily through open windows. Evelyn was seated on the couch scrolling through her phone when Julian placed the folder on the table between them. The restaurant receipt, the hotel invoice, the call log he had finally asked his assistant to retrieve. She looked at the papers, then up at him. And in that moment, Julian knew. There was no panic in her eyes, no fear, only calculation, brief, sharp, and gone in an instant. She exhaled slowly, set her phone aside, and leaned back as if preparing for a conversation she had already rehearsed. So she said quietly, "You found out?" The calmness of it struck him harder than anger ever could. Julian waited for denial, for excuses, for tears. Instead, Evelyn crossed her legs and studied him like a problem that had finally reached its conclusion. "How long?" he asked. She tilted her head, considering the question. "Long enough." His chest tightened. Was any of it real? That finally gave her pause, not guilt annoyance, as if the question complicated things unnecessarily. "Does it matter?" she replied. The words landed like a blade. Julian felt something inside him fracture, not explosively, but with a soft, devastating finality. He had prepared himself for betrayal. He had not prepared himself for indifference. She stood and began pacing, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, as if explaining a strategic decision rather than the end of a marriage. She told him she had felt lonely, that Marcus understood her in ways Julian never had, that she was tired of living in the shadow of his success, tired of being managed. Julian listened numb as she reframed their entire history. Every late night became neglect. Every cautious decision became control. Every structure he built for stability became a cage. And when Julian tried to speak, tried to remind her of shared moments of choices they made together, she waved it away. "That's your version," she said. "This is mine." The argument ended, not with resolution, but with a warning. "If you make this ugly," Evelyn said softly, "you won't like how it ends." Marcus arrived that evening, not as a lover hiding in the shadows, but as a professional stepping into the light. He spoke calmly, respectfully, outlining options, as if Julian were a client rather than a betrayed husband. He emphasized cooperation, discretion, mutual benefit. Julian stared at him in disbelief. "You're representing her, Julia Dovins," and said slowly, "after sleeping with her." Marcus didn't flinch. Personal matters are separate from legal expertise. Julian laughed, once sharp and hollow. "That's not how ethics work." Marcus smiled faintly. "Ethics are interpreted." That was when Julian understood how deep the rot went. From that moment on, everything accelerated. Documents arrived faster than Julian could review them. Meetings were scheduled with little notice. Marcus pushed deadlines, framing urgency as protection. Evelyn withdrew emotionally, communicating through her attorney, even while sharing the same roof. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a holding cell. Julian's own lawyer advised caution. Proving a conflict of interest would be difficult without concrete evidence. Marcus had insulated himself well. Everything was technically permissible, just close enough to the line to avoid consequence. In court filings, Evelyn's tone transformed completely. She was no longer distant or dismissive. She was wounded, afraid, trapped. Marcus constructed a narrative where Julian's financial acumen became manipulation. His silence became intimidation, and his success became imbalance. Julian watched as words reshaped reality. Witnesses were prepared. Timelines were curated. Context was stripped away. When Julian submitted evidence of transparency, shared accounts, joint access, it was reframed as oversight designed to confuse. Marcus objected relentlessly, redirected constantly, controlled the tempo. Julian felt himself losing ground, not because he lacked truth, but because he lacked theater. The affair, when acknowledged at all, was minimized. A distraction, an emotional footnote. Marcus positioned himself as a neutral party, who had stepped in only after the marriage had long since collapsed. Evelyn cried at precisely the right moments. Julian noticed how her voice trembled only when the judge looked directly at her. How her hands shook just enough to signal vulnerability, never enough to seem unstable. It was a performance honed with care. Julian couldn't compete with that. He wasn't wired for spectacle. He believed evidence spoke louder than emotion. He believed adults resolved disputes with facts. The system believed otherwise. Outside the courtroom, Marcus approached Julian, once lowering his voice so only Julian could hear. "You're a smart man," he said. "You know when a game is over." Julian met his gaze. "You're not winning because you're right." Marcus's smile widened. "Winning is the only right that matters." That night, Julian went home and stared at the city lights for hours. He replayed every decision that led him there. Every moment he chose efficiency over vigilance. Every warning he dismissed because it felt inconvenient. He thought of his grandfather again, of the man's quiet suspicion, his insistence on understanding, not just systems, but people. Julian had mastered one and neglected the other. As the trial date approached, the pressure intensified. Evelyn moved out, took artwork, took furniture, took pieces of a life that now felt curated for extraction. Each removal was accompanied by paperwork, authorization, legality. Julian felt like he was being dismantled piece by piece, each loss justified with a signature he had once trusted. On the eve of the hearing, Julian sat alone in the apartment, surrounded by boxes he hadn't touched in years. He opened one at random and found an old photograph his grandfather standing beside a modest building, arm resting protectively on Julian's shoulder. The memory hit him unexpectedly hard. The old man's voice echoed in his mind, steady and certain. "Never confuse silence with weakness," he had said once. "And never assume people show you their whole hand." Julien closed his eyes. For the first time since the betrayal began, he stopped reacting. He began observing. He noticed how Marcus rushed, how Evelyn avoided specifics, how both of them seemed confident not just in the outcome, but in Julien's exhaustion. They believed he was finished. That belief was their mistake. Julien didn't yet know how the story would turn. He didn't know what leverage he still had, or if he had any at all. But something inside him refused to accept that this was the end. The affair had been revealed, the trap exposed, and now, with nothing left to protect, Julien was finally free to see clearly. The legal trap didn't snap shut all at once. It tightened slowly, deliberately, until Julien could barely breathe without permission. Marcus Hale controlled everything now: the pace, the language, the pressure. What looked like negotiation was actually containment. Every email carried an artificial urgency. Every meeting was framed as the last chance to resolve things amicably. Every delay was subtly punished. Julien began to understand the strategy too late. Marcus didn't want to fight. He wanted exhaustion. The first move was financial isolation. Joint accounts were temporarily restricted pending review. Credit lines were frozen under the guise of compliance. Payments Julien had automated for years suddenly required approvals that never came on time. Each inconvenience was small enough to explain away, but together they formed a pattern. Julien was being slowly stripped of mobility. When he raised concerns, Marcus responded with calm reassurance. "These are standard procedures. Nothing to worry about if everything is above board. We're just protecting both parties." Evelyn echoed the same phrases as if rehearsed. Julien's lawyer pushed back where he could, filing motions, demanding transparency. Marcus countered with delays and technicalities. He buried requests under paperwork, and forced Julien's side to chase details that led nowhere. The process became a maze designed to wear him down. And it worked. Julien found himself waking up exhausted before the day even began. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from banks, attorneys, administrators. Each one required attention. Each one carried consequences if ignored. His work suffered. Clients sensed distraction. Deals stalled. The pressure wasn't just legal. It was psychological. Marcus knew exactly how to frame Julien's resistance as aggression. Any pushback became uncooperative behavior. Any insistence on fairness was labeled control. Marcus planted the idea early that Julien's strength was a threat that needed balancing. The court listened. In hearings, Marcus spoke in measured tones, positioning himself as the voice of reason. He praised Julien's success while subtly suggesting it made him dangerous. He painted Evelyn as someone overwhelmed by complexity she never asked for. Julien watched the judge nod along. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how plausible they sounded when arranged correctly. Julien began questioning his own memory. Had he been too distant, too focused on work? Had he ignored Evelyn's needs? The narrative pressed on him from all sides until doubt crept in uninvited. That doubt was Marcus's real weapon. The settlement proposal arrived 2 weeks before trial. It was devastating. Marcus framed it as generous, fair, a clean break. But when Julien read the numbers carefully, his stomach dropped. Asset transfers heavily favored Evelyn. Future earnings were partially exposed. Penalties were buried in footnotes. $20 million gone. Julien stared at the document for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on his chest. Accepting it would mean survival with humiliation. Fighting it meant risking even more: legal fees, public scrutiny, emotional collapse. Marcus followed up with a call that same evening. "I wouldn't recommend dragging this out," he said smoothly. "Judges don't like stubbornness." Julien clenched his jaw. "I'm not being stubborn. I'm being robbed." Marcus chuckled softly. Perspective is everything. That night, Julien barely slept. He paced the apartment, replaying the last few years in his mind. He saw how easily he had handed control to people he trusted, how every safeguard he believed in could be turned against him if someone knew where to push. By morning, his decision was made. He would fight. The trial was brutal. Marcus dominated the room. He objected, aggressively redirected constantly, and framed Julian's testimony as evasive, even when it was precise. Evelyn cried again, her voice breaking at moments that felt rehearsed. Witnesses spoke of her emotional distress. Experts testified about power imbalance. Julian's evidence felt heavy, technical, lifeless by comparison. The judge's patience wore thin. When the verdict came, Julian felt the floor drop out beneath him. The settlement was imposed worse than the proposal he had rejected. $20 million transferred, accounts reassigned, ownership dissolved. The court called it equitable. Julian heard the gavel strike as if from underwater. He stood as instructed, nodded as required, and left the courtroom without speaking. Cameras flashed outside, capturing his silence and mistaking it for guilt. By the time he reached the apartment, the reality had settled in fully. He was ruined. The man who had spent decades building quietly had been dismantled publicly. His name, once associated with discipline and success, now carried whispers. Investors pulled back. Colleagues avoided him. Friends didn't know what to say. Evelyn didn't contact him again. Marcus sent one final email, polite and conclusive, reminding Julian of his remaining obligations. Julian deleted it without replying. That night, as rain streaked down the windows, Julian sat on the floor, surrounded by emptiness. The furniture was gone. The walls echoed. His phone lay face down beside him, mercifully silent. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel it all. The anger, the humiliation, the grief. But beneath the pain was something else, cold and sharp, understanding. This hadn't been a legal loss. It had been a strategic one. Marcus and Evelyn hadn't won because they were right. They won because they had prepared for war, while Julian believed he was negotiating peace. Julian stood slowly and walked into the bedroom where only one corner remained untouched. The old boxes still sat there unnoticed by anyone who valued only what could be liquidated. He opened the leather folder again. This time, he looked closely. The notes weren't random. The dates weren't casual. His grandfather had tracked something carefully accounts institutions transfers that predated digital systems. Julian recognized patterns others would miss. The realization sent a chill through him. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a map. Julian sat back against the wall folder in his hands, heart pounding not with panic, but with possibility. Marcus believed the game was over. Evelyn believed she had won. They had taken everything they could see. But Julian was beginning to understand that the most important things had never been visible at all. The humiliation didn't end with the verdict. It lingered, clung to Julian like a shadow that followed him everywhere he went. In the days after the ruling, his name appeared in places it never had before. Not headlines, just mentions. Whispers in financial columns. Speculation in industry forums. The story had been simplified. For consumption, powerful financier loses big in divorce. A cautionary tale. A quiet scandal. No one talked about manipulation. No one talked about conflicts of interest. They talked about numbers and failure. Julian felt exposed in a way he never had before. Not physically, but narratively. His life had been reduced to a version he didn't recognize, one that painted him as reckless, arrogant, careless. People who had once sought his counsel now avoided eye contact. Invitations dried up. Phone calls went unanswered. The courtroom itself replayed endlessly in his mind. He remembered standing at the witness stand, hands resting on the polished wood, answering questions he never imagined he'd have to answer. Marcus's voice had been smooth, almost sympathetic, as he guided Julian through carefully constructed traps. Would you agree Marcus had asked that you controlled the majority of financial decisions in the marriage? Julian had answered honestly. Yes, with her knowledge. Marcus nodded, as if satisfied. So Mrs. Hart depended on you completely? No, Julian said. She trusted me. Marcus turned slightly toward the judge. Trust without understanding can be a form of control. Wouldn't you say Julian felt the shift in the room then? The subtle lean forward, the interest. Every answer Julian gave was reframed. Every clarification was interrupted. Marcus had mastered the art of implication. He didn't need to accuse Julian directly. He let the silence do the work. When Evelyn testified, the contrast was stark. She spoke softly, carefully. Her hands trembled just enough to suggest vulnerability. She talked about confusion, about fear, about feeling lost in a world of numbers she never chose. Julian watched her with disbelief. This was the woman who once debated market trends with him over breakfast. The woman who had signed documents after reading summaries and asking questions. The woman who had insisted on certain clauses now being used as evidence against him. Marcus never asked her about those moments. Julian's attorney tried to object, tried to reintroduce context, but the rhythm was against them. Marcus moved faster, spoke louder, controlled the flow. By the time Julian's lawyer regained footing, the impression had already been set. Julian remembered the judge's expression when the verdict was read, not cruel, not indifferent, but tired. As if this was just another imbalance corrected, another case closed. That look haunted him. After the ruling, Julian had shaken his attorney's hand politely and walked out without looking back. He didn't trust himself to speak. Words felt dangerous. Anything he said could be twisted further. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. Cameras flashed. Somewhere behind him, Evelyn cried again, this time for the audience waiting outside. Julian didn't turn around. Now, days later, the echoes of that humiliation followed him into quiet spaces. The grocery store, the elevator, the bank, especially the bank. When Julian visited his primary branch to inquire about his remaining accounts, the teller spoke to him differently, carefully, formally, as if he were a risk. "I'm sorry, Mr. Crow," she said. "Your access is limited pending review." Julian forced a nod. "I understand." He didn't mention that he had built half the systems that governed those reviews. He didn't mention that he knew exactly how arbitrary they could be. He left with nothing resolved. That night, he returned to the apartment soon to be sold, according to the settlement, and sat on the floor with his grandfather's folder open in front of him. He read through the notes slowly, deliberately, as if decoding a language he had once known but forgotten. Dates jumped out at him. 1990, 1991. Institutions that had merged, dissolved, rebranded. Julian began cross-referencing names, tracing lines between entities. His mind slipped into familiar territory, the calm focus of analysis. For the first time since the verdict, his breathing steadied. This was something Marcus couldn't touch. Something Evelyn had never known existed. Julian felt a surge of anger, not explosive, but precise. The kind that sharpened thought instead of clouding it. He thought back to the courtroom again, to the moment Marcus had leaned in and whispered that the game was over. Julian smiled faintly to himself. The game Marcus played was public, loud, dependent on perception. What Julian was beginning to see operated in silence. The next humiliation came in the form of an invitation, or rather the lack of one. An annual industry dinner Julian had attended for years came and went without his name on the guest list. He found out through a colleague who sounded uncomfortable even mentioning it. They didn't want complications, the colleague said carefully. Julian thanked him and ended the call. That night, he poured himself a drink he barely tasted and stood by the window watching the city below. He felt stripped, not just of wealth, but of identity. The roles he had played, husband, provider, authority, had been dismantled in a matter of weeks, but beneath the loss was something else: clarity. He saw now how easily narratives could be weaponized, how systems rewarded those who understood not just rules, but optics, how trust, once misplaced, became liability. Julian also saw his own mistake with brutal honesty. He had believed decency was enough. His grandfather had known better. The old man had lived through eras when records were paper, when trust was personal, when survival required foresight. He had built layers Julian never questioned because they seemed unnecessary in a modern world. Now those layers were all Julian had left. As midnight approached, Julian made a decision. He would disappear not physically, but strategically. No interviews, no public defenses, no emotional reactions. He would let the world believe the story it had been given. Meanwhile, he would work. He closed the folder gently and placed it back into the box, then stacked the boxes neatly against the wall. To anyone else, they looked like clutter. To Julian, they were a lifeline. The humiliation had stripped him down to essentials. And in that stripping away, something unexpected had happened. He had nothing left to lose. That thought settled over him like armor. Marcus and Evelyn believed the story had ended in a courtroom. They believed the verdict was final. Julian knew better now. The most dangerous stories don't end when the audience thinks they do. They end when the truth is ready to surface. Absolute ruin didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly disguised as administrative emails and polite reminders. Within a week of the verdict, Julian's remaining accounts were reviewed, reclassified, and constrained. Not seized, just limited enough to feel constant pressure. His credit score dipped after automatic payments failed. Insurance policies lapsed because approvals were pending. Even his phone carrier flagged his account for verification. Everything worked, just not for him. He learned quickly how invisible systems could suffocate a person without ever appearing hostile. Each call ended with the same tone, professional, apologetic, final. "We understand your frustration. Our hands are tied. This is temporary." Temporary stretched into days, then weeks. Julian stopped checking his balance. The numbers no longer meant anything. What mattered was access, and that was being rationed. He sold a watch to cover basic expenses, then felt absurd for owning it in the first place. He canceled subscriptions he had forgotten existed. He cooked for himself not because he needed to save money, but because the ritual gave him something to control. Friends drifted away. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. A few reached out with awkward messages. "Hope you're okay. Let me know if you need anything," then never followed up. Others went silent entirely. Julian didn't blame them. People were drawn to momentum, and his had stalled. The apartment emptied further as movers returned to collect items allocated by the settlement. Each visit felt like an audit of his life. Boxes labeled and removed with efficiency. The sound of tape ripping echoed like punctuation. Julian watched without interfering. At night, the silence grew louder. The city outside hummed with continuity while his own routines collapsed. He slept poorly, waking at odd hours with his heart racing, replaying moments from the trial as if he could re-edit them. Sometimes he imagined saying different things. Sometimes he imagined walking away earlier. Mostly he imagined nothing at all, just an endless blankness where the future used to be. One afternoon, Julian found himself standing in a grocery store aisle, staring at shelves of identical products, unable to choose. The decision felt trivial and overwhelming at the same time. He left with nothing, embarrassed by his own hesitation. This, he realized, was the true damage. Not the money, not the reputation. It was the erosion of confidence, the slow poisoning of instinct. Marcus and Evelyn had taken more than assets. They had disrupted Julian's sense of reality, taught him to doubt his perceptions, to question his judgment at every turn. That doubt was heavier than debt. The call from his mother came late one evening. She didn't ask about the money. She didn't mention the divorce. She just asked if he was eating, if he was sleeping, if he had someone checking in on him. Julian answered honestly for the first time in weeks. After they hung up, he sat on the floor of the living room back against the wall and let himself feel the grief he had been avoiding. Not the loss of wealth, but the loss of a future he had assumed was secure. The loss of identity. The loss of trust. He cried quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't seek comfort. When it passed, something else took its place. Focus. Julian pulled the boxes closer and began organizing them methodically. He sorted papers by decade, by institution, by relevance. He created a spreadsheet, not digital, but handwritten at first, to slow himself down and force precision. Patterns emerged. Transfers that predated his career. Accounts opened under trusts that had since dissolved. Notes about custodians that no longer existed. Julian's grandfather had built redundancies upon redundancies, anticipating institutional decay long before it became fashionable to do so. Julian felt a strange gratitude. The old man had never explained everything. He had simply prepared. Julian began making calls, careful ones. Not to lawyers or banks, but to archivists, historians, former regulators. People who understood how things used to work before automation erased memory. Most were skeptical. Some were dismissive. One was curious. A retired compliance officer listened patiently as Julian described the notes, the dates, the institutions. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. People forget the man said that before everything went digital, records lived in basements. In boxes no one wanted to catalog. Julian felt his pulse quicken. So it's possible. It's possible, the man replied. But it won't be easy. Julian smiled for the first time in days. Easy was never part of the plan. Meanwhile, the outside world continued without him. Evelyn appeared once in a lifestyle article framed as resilient and empowered. Marcus was quoted in a legal journal about navigating complex divorces with professionalism. Julian didn't read the comments. He focused on what he could verify. Late one night, he uncovered a note he had missed, before a single line written in his grandfather's careful hand. Silence preserves value. Julian stared at it for a long time. He understood now. This wasn't about confrontation, not yet. It was about patience, about letting others believe the story was finished while he worked in the margins. He stopped responding to messages that carried subtext. He declined interviews. He avoided places where he might be recognized. He became deliberately uninteresting. That invisibility was a relief. In the quiet, his mind sharpened. The fog of shock lifted, replaced by a steady, controlled determination. He mapped out next steps, contingencies, timelines. Not revenge, reclamation. The ruin had stripped him of distractions. It had forced him back to fundamentals, analysis, discipline, restraint. The very traits that had built his success in the first place. Julian stood one morning in the nearly empty apartment, sunlight cutting across bare floors, and felt something he hadn't felt since before the trial. Stability. Not in circumstances. In self. He didn't know how long the process would take. Months, maybe longer. He didn't know how much of what was lost could be recovered. But he knew this: the man who had been broken by the verdict no longer existed. In his place stood someone quieter, harder, and far more dangerous to underestimate. Absolute ruin had been the lie they told him to end the story. In reality, it was only the clearing of the stage. The memory surfaced without warning. Julian was folding one of the last shirts he still owned when the scent of old paper drifted up from the open box beside him. It was faint dust ink time, but it pulled him backward with a force he couldn't ignore. He sat down slowly and lifted a photograph from the box. It showed his grandfather standing in front of a narrow brick building, one hand resting on Julian's shoulder. Julian couldn't have been more than 12. The building behind them looked ordinary, no signage, no distinguishing features. Just brick windows and a door half hidden by shadow. On the back of the photograph, written in that same careful script, were 2 words, still standing. Julian's throat tightened. He had forgotten that day. They had taken a train together, his grandfather unusually quiet the entire ride. When they arrived, the old man had paused outside the building, looking at it not with nostalgia, but with assessment, as if checking to see whether something had survived. Julian remembered asking what the place was. His grandfather had smiled faintly. A reminder, he'd said, that not everything needs attention to grow. At the time, Julian had been disappointed. He expected a story, a revelation. Instead, they had gone for lunch, talked about school, and returned home. The building was never mentioned again. Until now. Julian placed the photograph beside the notes and felt the pieces begin to align. The dates, the institutions, the way his grandfather had cataloged information without explanation. He had been leaving breadcrumbs not for curiosity, but for necessity. This was a contingency. Julian's heart pounded as he scanned the notes again, this time with purpose. There it was, an address matching the building in the photograph. A bank name that no longer existed, crossed out and replaced with another. A year circled heavily, 1990. Julian closed his eyes. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "If you ever need it," he used to say, "you'll know." Julian knew now. The next morning, he left the apartment early, carrying only the folder and the photograph. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't even say it out loud to himself. The less the idea solidified, the safer it felt. The building still stood. It looked smaller than Julian remembered, pressed between newer structures, its brick darkened by time. A modest plaque near the door listed a financial institution Julian recognized only vaguely, a name absorbed by mergers decades ago. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and paper. Not modern, not efficient, deliberate. An elderly receptionist looked up as Julian approached. "I'm looking for records," he said carefully. "Old ones." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You'll want the archive desk." The man behind the desk had silver hair and glasses that slid down his nose when he leaned forward. He listened without interruption as Julian explained about the account, the year, the name. When Julian finished, the man leaned back and exhaled slowly. "We don't get many requests like this," he said. "Most people don't know what to ask for." Julian handed him the photograph. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "I remember this place," he said. "Before the merger. Before the digitization." He stood and gestured for Julian to follow. They descended into a lower level where the lighting dimmed and the walls were lined with cabinets labeled in fading ink. The man unlocked a drawer and began flipping through files with practiced ease. Julian's pulse roared in his ears. After several minutes, the man stopped. "There it is," he murmured. He slid a file out and placed it on the table. Julian stared at the name printed on the tab. His grandfather's. The account had been opened in 1990 under a trust structure that no longer existed. It had been intentionally designed to survive institutional collapse, insulated from common reporting mechanisms. Over the years, it had accrued quietly untouched compounding without notice. Julian struggled to breathe. "Why was it never flagged?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "Because no one was looking for it." Julian ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed. The account wasn't joint. It wasn't marital. It wasn't even in his name, not directly. It had passed to him through mechanisms Evelyn and Marcus had never considered, never questioned, because they had assumed everything of value had already been cataloged. "How much is in it?" Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man slid a printed statement across the table. Julian stared at the number. It exceeded what he had lost, by a wide margin. Julian closed his eyes, emotions surging up in waves: relief, disbelief, gratitude, rage. Not triumph, not yet. Just the profound realization that he had never truly been powerless. The man cleared his throat. "Access won't be immediate. There will be verification. Time." Julian nodded. "I understand." As he left the building, the city looked different, sharper, more alive. The weight he had carried for weeks lifted just enough to let him stand straighter. He didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was an opportunity. Julian knew now what his grandfather had been protecting. And more importantly, he knew why it had been hidden. Wealth that remained unseen could not be weaponized. Marcus and Evelyn believed they had stripped him bare. They had only taken what he had allowed them to see. Julian returned to his apartment and placed the folder back into the box with care. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call anyone. He didn't even check the statement again. Instead, he sat down and began to plan. This time, he would not rush. This time, silence would be his greatest asset. Julian didn't tell anyone about the account. Not his mother. Not the one colleague who still checked in occasionally. Not even the retired compliance officer who had helped him make the connection. Silence wasn't just caution now, it was strategy. The moment he left the building, he understood what revealing the discovery too early would do. It would attract attention, questions, lawyers. And Marcus Hale thrived on questions. He fed on them, twisted them, weaponized them. So Julian disappeared in the most deliberate way possible. He stopped going to places where he might be recognized. He changed routines. He paid in cash when he could. He avoided anything that created a digital trail. To the outside world, he remained the man who had lost everything and quietly retreated. Behind that image, he worked. The first thing Julian did was verify not the balance, but the structure. He spent days mapping the legal lineage of the account, tracing how the trust had evolved through regulatory shifts, how custodianship had transferred when institutions collapsed or merged. His grandfather had designed it to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. Julian felt a surge of respect every time he uncovered another layer. This wasn't luck. It was foresight. He began visiting archives, some physical, some human. Retired bankers, former regulators. People who remembered how things used to be done before everything became transparent in theory and opaque in practice. Julian didn't present himself as a victim. He presented himself as a student. People opened up. One former auditor explained how legacy trusts slipped through reporting cracks if they met certain criteria. Another described how records stored off-network could remain invisible for decades if no trigger event occurred. Julian listened more than he spoke. He learned that what protected the account also made it dangerous to mishandle. One wrong move could flag it. One careless inquiry could invite scrutiny that Marcus might eventually hear about through professional circles. Julian couldn't afford that. So he built a buffer. He incorporated a small consulting firm under a neutral name staffed by contractors who didn't know each other. Through that entity, he retained a boutique legal team, one with no overlap with Marcus's professional network. They specialized in legacy assets, not divorce litigation. Julian interviewed them carefully, testing not just competence, but temperament. He needed people who understood discretion, who valued patience over spectacle. When he found the right team, he didn't tell them the whole story at once. He gave them pieces, a date, a structure, a hypothetical scenario. Their reactions told him everything he needed to know. It's viable, one attorney said quietly, but it has to be handled with precision. Julian nodded. Precision is all I have. As the days passed, Julian felt his old instincts return. The calm focus, the ability to think several moves ahead without rushing. This was the version of himself Marcus had never seen, the one that operated in silence. Meanwhile, the outside narrative continued without him. Evelyn posted carefully curated images online. New apartment, new clothes, a life framed as renewal. Marcus published another article positioning himself as an authority on ethical representation. Julian didn't react. Instead, he began compiling something else. A timeline. He revisited every document from the divorce proceedings this time, not as a participant, but as an analyst. He examined patterns in Marcus's filings. The sequencing, the urgency, the way certain disclosures were avoided while others were emphasized. A pattern emerged. Marcus hadn't just represented Evelyn. He had orchestrated the process in ways that bordered on exploitation. Subtle, deniable, but consistent. Conflicts disclosed just late enough to be technically compliant. Motions filed in a sequence that limited Julian's response window. Julian began cross-referencing these tactics with other cases Marcus had handled. The similarities were unsettling. This wasn't personal. It was procedural. Julian understood then that reclaiming his own stability wasn't enough. The account gave him security, but it also gave him leverage if he chose to use it. The question was how. He spent long nights considering his options. He could disappear entirely, rebuild quietly, let Evelyn and Marcus believe they had won. It would be safer, easier. But the thought left a bitter taste. Julian wasn't driven by revenge. He didn't want to hurt them the way they had hurt him. What he wanted was balanced truth restored to a system that had been manipulated. And for the first time since the trial, he saw a path. The key wasn't the money, it was evidence. Julian's legal team confirmed what he suspected: if Marcus's conflict of interest could be proven not just ethically questionable, but materially harmful, the entire case could be reopened. Sanctions, investigations, consequences. But proof had to be airtight. Julian began gathering it. He requested public records. He interviewed former clients of Marcus under the guise of academic research. He paid for expert reviews of filing patterns. Slowly, meticulously, he built a case that didn't rely on emotion or narrative. It relied on facts. Throughout it all, Julian maintained the illusion of defeat. He declined opportunities. He turned down invitations. He let rumors persist. The more the world believed he was finished, the safer he became. One evening, as Julian reviewed notes spread across his kitchen table, he paused and looked around the nearly empty apartment. The place no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a staging ground. He thought of his grandfather again. The old man had never talked about justice in grand terms. He talked about preparedness, about knowing when to act and when to wait. Julian smiled faintly. Waiting, he had learned, was not weakness. It was discipline. As the investigation progressed, Julian felt something unexpected: peace. Not because things were resolved, but because he was no longer lost. Every action had purpose. Every day moved him closer to clarity. He didn't know how long it would take, months, perhaps longer. But he was no longer racing against fear. He was moving with intention. Marcus and Evelyn continued their lives, unaware that the ground beneath them was being examined, inch by inch. They believed the story had ended, that the verdict had sealed everything. Julian knew better. The past, when examined carefully enough, had a way of resurfacing. And when it did, it rarely arrived alone. The confirmation arrived quietly, the way all truly significant things seem to now. Julian was seated across from his legal team in a narrow conference room with frosted glass walls when the senior attorney slid a single document across the table. No flourish, no dramatic pause, just paper aligned carefully as if precision itself were a form of respect. "This is the final verification," the attorney said. "The account is legitimate. The transfer of custodianship to you is valid." And most importantly, he tapped the page once. "It is entirely separate from the marital estate." Julian didn't reach for the paper immediately. He had learned not to rush moments like this. Instead, he studied the attorney's face, looking for hesitation, for doubt. There was none. When Julian finally looked down, the numbers were stark in their simplicity. No commas exaggerated, no formatting designed to impress, just a figure that told the truth plainly. The account his grandfather had opened in 1990 had grown quietly for over 3 decades. Through recessions, through booms, through regulatory overhauls and market collapses. It had survived because it was never designed to be seen. The balance exceeded $20 million, not by a little. Julian felt his breath catch, not with triumph, but with a strange grounding calm. The kind that comes when uncertainty collapses into clarity. He had not been ruined. He had been redirected. The attorney continued speaking, outlining next steps: access protocols, reporting obligations, risk mitigation. Julian listened carefully, asking questions that revealed just how much of himself he had reclaimed. He wasn't the shaken man they had met weeks earlier. He was precise again, controlled. "Is there any exposure?" Julian asked. The attorney shook his head. "Not unless you create it. As long as the account remains untouched publicly, it stays insulated." Julian nodded. "Then it stays untouched." The room was silent for a moment. Another attorney leaned forward. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Julian met her gaze. "It means I don't need to rush." That understanding was power. Julian left the meeting and walked the long way home, passing through parts of the city he hadn't seen in years. He felt lighter, but not euphoric. The account wasn't a finish line. It was a foundation, one his grandfather had poured long before Julian knew he would need it. He thought of the man's hands, steady even in old age. The way he never explained everything at once. The way he trusted Julian to find answers when the time came. That trust humbled him. At the apartment, Julian sat by the window and watched dusk settle over the skyline. He allowed himself one moment, just one, to imagine what might have happened if he had never opened that box, never followed that memory. Marcus and Evelyn would have moved on, unchallenged. The narrative would have solidified. Julian would have disappeared quietly, another cautionary tale. The account changed that. But Julian also understood something deeper now. Wealth recovered did not undo damage done. It didn't erase betrayal or humiliation. It didn't restore trust in systems that had failed him. What it did restore was agency. Julian opened his laptop and reviewed the growing dossier his team had compiled on Marcus Hale. The patterns were undeniable now. Conflicts disclosed late. Motions timed strategically to limit response. Clients pressured into settlements under the guise of protection. This wasn't incompetence. It was design. Julian's phone buzzed a message from his mother, asking if he was doing all right. He replied honestly for the first time in months. "I'm stable," he wrote. "I'm thinking clearly." That was the truth. Over the next few days, Julian made subtle adjustments. He renewed insurance policies through independent brokers. He re-established lines of communication with a few trusted contacts, careful not to reveal anything beyond his regained composure. People noticed. Not the money, the change. Julian stood straighter, spoke with calm assurance. The desperation that had clung to him after the verdict was gone. In its place was something quieter, more dangerous to those who underestimated him. Patience. The account remained untouched. Julian resisted every temptation to use it to fix immediate discomforts. He paid rent late without anxiety. He wore the same clothes without embarrassment. He let the illusion of loss persist. Because the illusion was working, Marcus didn't reach out. Evelyn didn't check in. Why would they? As far as they knew, Julian had been reduced to damage control and regret. That belief allowed Julian to move freely. One evening, Julian visited the small brick building again, standing across the street this time. The windows glowed softly. Nothing about it suggested significance. He whispered a quiet thank you, not to the building, but to the man who had known the world well enough to prepare for its worst versions. Julian understood now that his grandfather hadn't been hoarding wealth. He had been preserving leverage. Back at the apartment, Julian organized his notes into 2 stacks. One was labeled stability. The other was labeled accountability. The first ensured Julian would never be vulnerable like that again. The second would determine whether Marcus and Evelyn continued living comfortably inside a lie. Julian stared at the second stack for a long time. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger rushed decisions. Anger made mistakes. What he felt now was resolve. If he moved forward, it would not be loud. It would not be emotional. It would be exact. He closed the folder and placed it carefully into a drawer. The account had changed everything, but not in the way Marcus and Evelyn would expect. It hadn't made Julian reckless. It had made him free. Julian rebuilt quietly the way he had always known how to. There were no grand announcements, no sudden displays of wealth, no visible signs that anything in his circumstances had changed. To the outside world, he was still the man who had lost everything and retreated into the background. That illusion became his shield. He started with structure. Using the consulting firm he had established, Julian brought in specialists one by one. Never all at once, never in the same room. A forensic accountant with a reputation for patience. A legal ethics expert who had testified against major firms and walked away unscathed. A data analyst skilled in reconstructing timelines from incomplete records. None of them knew the full picture. They didn't need to. Julian learned long ago that information traveled fastest when too many people held it. So he compartmentalized, assigning each expert a narrow task, a precise question. He didn't frame it as a personal vendetta. He framed it as research, and research done properly spoke for itself. Days settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for analysis, afternoons for calls and document reviews, evenings for reflection. Julian slept better now, not deeply, but without panic. His mind no longer raced in circles. Every thought had direction. The account remained untouched. It was tempting, of course. A single transfer could have restored comfort instantly. But Julian resisted. He understood that comfort was not the goal. Control was. The more invisible he remained, the more freedom he had to maneuver. The first real breakthrough came quietly buried in a footnote of a previous case Marcus Hale had handled years earlier. The forensic accountant flagged it during a routine review, a discrepancy in disclosed relationships that hadn't been challenged at the time. Julian leaned closer as the accountant explained. Marcus disclosed a prior professional relationship, she said, tapping the screen, but omitted a financial interest that would have required recusal if revealed fully. Julian's pulse quickened. Was it material? Yes, she replied. And it set a precedent. That precedent mattered. Julian passed the information to the ethics expert, who confirmed what Julian had already suspected. Marcus had a pattern of skating just inside the boundaries of disclosure, exploiting technicalities to maintain plausible deniability. It's not one violation, the expert said. It's a system. Julian nodded. Systems fail when patterns are exposed. He instructed the team to keep digging. As weeks passed, the file on Marcus thickened. Each new discovery reinforced the same conclusion. This wasn't a lapse in judgment or an isolated conflict. It was a deliberate strategy repeated across cases, refined over time. Evelyn appeared in the data too, not as a mastermind, but as a willing participant. Emails showed she had been briefed on legal strategies that benefited her financially while disadvantaging Julian procedurally. Messages revealed timing decisions coordinated to maximize pressure. Julian read those emails once. He didn't reread them. The betrayal no longer surprised him. It clarified. What did surprise him was how calm he felt. The pain that had once dominated his thoughts had dulled into something distant, manageable. He wasn't reliving the past anymore. He was assembling it. One evening, Julian met with his legal team in person for the first time in weeks. The room was small, unremarkable. No one raised their voice. No one expressed outrage. They discussed options: a formal ethics complaint, a motion to reopen proceedings, an independent investigation request submitted through the appropriate regulatory body. Each option carried risk. Each required timing. Julian listened, weighing probabilities. What's the cleanest path, he asked. The senior attorney considered this. If we proceed quietly and let the evidence speak, we reduce the chance of retaliation. But it will take longer, Julian nodded. Then we take longer. The team exchanged glances, not skepticism, but respect. They had all worked with clients who wanted immediate justice, loud justice. Julian wanted durable justice. Outside that room, Marcus Hale continued his life unbothered. He accepted new clients. He attended conferences. He expanded his practice. In interviews, he spoke confidently about transparency and ethical responsibility. Julian watched from a distance, not with bitterness, with interest. He understood now that Marcus's greatest strength, his visibility, was also his greatest vulnerability. The more Marcus spoke about ethics, the higher the standard he set for himself. Julian planned to let that standard do the work. As the months passed, Julian felt himself solidify into someone new. Not hardened, but refined. He no longer reacted emotionally to setbacks. He anticipated them. He no longer assumed goodwill. He assessed incentives. This version of himself felt closer to the boy his grandfather had trained than the man he had become during his marriage. One afternoon, Julian visited his grandfather's grave for the first time since the verdict. He stood there in silence, hands in his coat pockets, feeling the cool air settle around him. I understand now, he said softly, why you never explained everything. He didn't wait for an answer. Back at the apartment, Julian packed the last of his things. The lease would end soon, and he had no intention of staying, not because he couldn't afford it, but because it belonged to a chapter he had finished reading. He chose a smaller place across town. Unremarkable, quiet, no view worth photographing. It suited him perfectly. The move went unnoticed. That invisibility pleased him. The final piece fell into place when the ethics expert delivered her assessment in writing. It was thorough, precise, and devastating. It outlined not just what Marcus had done, but how his actions had systematically disadvantaged opposing parties while enriching those he favored. Julian read the report slowly. This was it. The moment he had been working toward without ever rushing. He didn't file anything immediately. Instead, he placed the report into a folder and locked it away. Because timing, he had learned, was everything. And the moment to act would come, not when he felt ready, but when Marcus felt safest. Julian waited. Not because he hesitated, but because he understood momentum. He watched Marcus Hale's calendar the way traders watched markets looking for overconfidence for the moments when exposure peaked and caution dipped. Those moments always came disguised as success. Marcus found his moment at a national legal conference. He was scheduled to speak on a panel about ethical advocacy in high-stakes divorce litigation. The irony was almost elegant. Julian learned of it through a trade bulletin forwarded casually by one of his analysts, accompanied by a single line, "This is the window." Julian didn't smile. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt alignment. 2 days before the conference, Julian's legal team submitted the first filing, not a lawsuit, not a public accusation, but a formal ethics complaint to the regulatory body with jurisdiction over Marcus's license. It was meticulously documented, unemotional, and devastating in its restraint. No press, no leaks, just facts. The complaint outlined conflicts of interest, delayed disclosures, and a clear pattern of procedural manipulation across multiple cases. Julian's own case was referenced, but only as part of a broader structure. This wasn't about one divorce. It was about professional conduct. Within 48 hours, the inquiry was opened. Marcus received notice the morning of his panel. He still showed up. Julian watched the live stream from his quiet apartment, sitting at a plain table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. Marcus looked composed on camera, confident, even amused, as he spoke about transparency and trust. But Julian noticed the subtle signs, the tighter jaw, the slightly rushed cadence. Marcus knew. By the second day of the conference, whispers had begun. Nothing concrete, just questions. Marcus's firm released a brief statement affirming their commitment to ethical standards. It was the kind of statement Julian had learned to read between. Meanwhile, Julian's team moved to the next phase. They filed a motion to reopen the divorce proceedings, not on emotional grounds, not on new financial claims, but on procedural fairness. The motion cited the ethics inquiry, the undisclosed conflict, and the demonstrable impact on Julian's ability to respond during litigation. The court couldn't ignore it. A hearing was scheduled. Evelyn found out through her attorney. She called Julian for the first time in months. He let it go to voicemail. When she called again, he answered calmly. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with panic she couldn't quite control. Julian listened. "It's a review." "You're trying to destroy him," she said. Julian paused. "I'm letting the system examine what it missed." "You lost?" she snapped. "You don't get to change that." Julian's voice remained steady. "I didn't lose. I was obstructed." The line went silent. Julian hung up gently. The next few weeks unfolded with careful precision. The ethics board requested documents. Marcus's firm cooperated publicly while scrambling privately. Associates whispered. Clients hesitated. The hearing arrived quietly without cameras or commentary. Julian walked into the courtroom not as a desperate man, but as a prepared one. He wore a simple suit, nothing designed to impress. He sat straight, hands folded, eyes forward. Marcus avoided looking at him. The judge listened. This time, Julian didn't need to perform. He didn't need to argue narrative or emotion. The evidence spoke clearly. Timelines aligned. Omissions became obvious. What had once been framed as strategy now appeared as manipulation. Evelyn sat behind Marcus, her posture rigid. The performance she had perfected months earlier felt out of place now. There was no audience for tears. When Marcus's counsel attempted to deflect, the judge stopped him. "Answer the question," she said sharply. Julian felt a quiet shift in the room. The system, when confronted with undeniable structure, corrected itself. The ruling didn't come immediately. It didn't need to. The damage was already done. The ethics board announced formal proceedings. Marcus's speaking engagements were canceled. His firm placed him on administrative leave, pending investigation. The illusion of authority cracked. Evelyn's attorney approached Julian's team afterward, proposing discussion. Julian declined. He wasn't interested in negotiation anymore. Weeks later, the ethics board released its findings. They were unequivocal. Marcus Hale was found to have violated multiple professional standards, including failure to disclose material conflicts of interest and engaging in conduct that materially disadvantaged opposing parties. His license was suspended pending further review. The news spread quickly. Articles appeared. Clients withdrew. The firm distanced itself, publicly issuing statements about accountability. Marcus vanished from professional spaces almost overnight. Julian read none of it. He focused on the final step. The court revisited the divorce settlement in light of the findings. Not everything could be undone. Systems resisted complete reversal, but enough was corrected to restore balance. Assets were reallocated. Penalties imposed. Julian was compensated for procedural harm. Evelyn faced the consequences quietly. The narrative she had relied on collapsed without spectacle. No public apology, no redemption arc. Just a gradual erosion of credibility and comfort. Julian didn't attend the final hearing. He didn't need to. The system, once corrected, did its work. On a cool morning months later, Julian stood in his new apartment, smaller, quieter, entirely his, and packed the last box from the old life. He carried it down the stairs himself and placed it in the trunk of his car. There was no triumph in the gesture, just closure. Julian drove past the small brick building one last time on his way out of the city. He slowed, glanced at it, and continued on. The counterattack had never been about destruction. It had been about correction. And in that correction, Julian found something more valuable than restitution. He found himself again. Exposure didn't arrive with a single headline. It unfolded in layers, each one peeling back a version of the truth that Marcus Hale had carefully curated for years. Julian noticed it first in the silences. A week after the ethics board's findings were released, Marcus's name stopped appearing in industry newsletters. Panels quietly replaced him. Articles that once quoted him were edited, his name removed without explanation. It was as if the professional world had agreed without formal announcement to step back. Silence, Julian had learned, was rarely accidental. Evelyn felt the shift almost immediately. The friends who had once rallied around her began responding more slowly. Invitations softened, then disappeared. Conversations that once carried sympathy now carried distance. People didn't accuse her. They didn't need to. They simply stopped believing the version of events she had sold so convincingly. The exposure wasn't loud. It was isolating. Julian heard about it indirectly through neutral channels. A former acquaintance mentioned Evelyn had left a charity board to focus on personal matters. A real estate agent quietly confirmed her new apartment had been listed again sooner than expected. Julian didn't ask questions. He focused on the legal aftermath. As Marcus's suspension triggered deeper reviews, other cases surfaced, clients who had settled quickly under pressure, opposing parties who had felt manipulated but lacked proof at the time. With the pattern now established, those voices carried weight. Julian's team compiled supplemental documentation and submitted it where appropriate. Always factual, always restrained. He refused to be seen as the driver of a vendetta. He was a witness, not a crusader. The media eventually caught on. The first article framed it cautiously. Prominent attorney faces ethics review amid conflict allegations. It mentioned Julian only in passing as one of several affected parties. Julian appreciated that. It kept the focus where it belonged. Then came the follow-ups. Investigative pieces began connecting dots Marcus had relied on remaining separate. Patterns were named, language sharpened. Phrases like systemic misconduct replaced isolated oversight. Julian read one article late at night, not out of obsession but curiosity. He noticed how little emotion it contained. That restraint gave it credibility. Evelyn tried to control the narrative one last time. She released a statement through a publicist expressing shock at the findings, distancing herself from Marcus's actions, reaffirming her own integrity. The statement used careful language, no admissions, no direct denials. It didn't land. Too much had shifted. People noticed what wasn't said. The absence of accountability, the timing, the way her story changed subtly as if adapting to new information rather than clarifying old truths. Julian received a message from her late one evening. I didn't know it read. You have to believe that. Julian stared at the screen for a long moment. He typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. In the end, he sent nothing. Belief he understood now was not something he owed. The exposure reached its peak when Marcus's firm announced his permanent separation. The statement was brief and formal, emphasizing the firm's commitment to ethical practice. Marcus issued his own response shortly after, defensive, vague, framed as misunderstanding. It satisfied no one. Julian never heard from him directly. That silence told him everything. As the weeks passed, the practical consequences became clear. Marcus's clients dispersed. His professional network collapsed inward. Without the authority of his title, the confidence that once shielded him evaporated. Julian didn't feel joy watching it happen. He felt confirmation. This was how accountability worked when allowed to function. Slowly, impersonally, without theatrics. The court finalized adjustments to Julian's case quietly. No press, no spectacle, just paperwork that corrected what could be corrected. Julian received compensation for procedural harm and regained assets that had been unfairly transferred. He directed the funds immediately into structures that ensured privacy and stability. He had no interest in visible restoration. Evelyn's financial situation tightened. Without Marcus's guidance, she struggled to navigate the systems she had once relied on. Deals fell through. Advisors kept their distance. The confidence she had worn like armor began to crack. Julian encountered her once unexpectedly at a cafe across town. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally. Her posture lacked the assurance he remembered. When she saw him, her expression flickered through surprised defensiveness, then something close to regret. She approached hesitantly. I didn't think you'd still be here, she said. Julian met her gaze calmly. I was never gone. They stood in silence for a moment. I didn't plan for this, she said quietly. Julian nodded. Most people don't plan for consequences. They plan for outcomes. She looked down. Do you hate me? Julian considered the question carefully. No, he said finally. I don't trust you. There's a difference. She swallowed, nodded once, and stepped back. That was the end of it. Julian left the cafe feeling lighter than he expected. Not because the encounter resolved anything, but because it confirmed how far he had moved beyond the need for resolution. Exposure had done its work. The truth no longer needed his protection. In the months that followed, Julian focused on rebuilding not wealth, but alignment. He consulted selectively, investing in projects that valued long-term impact over visibility. He declined opportunities that smelled of ego. He chose quiet competence. People who worked with him noticed the difference. He's precise, one colleague remarked. And impossible to rush. Julian smiled at that. He thought often of his grandfather, of the man's quiet preparation and patience. The exposure had validated those lessons in ways Julian never could have imagined. The world didn't need him to shout the truth. It needed him to survive long enough for the truth to surface on its own. And it had. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. Julian stood in the quiet hallway outside the courtroom, hands loosely clasped, listening as the final hearing unfolded behind closed doors. There were no reporters this time. No audience. No sense of spectacle. Just procedure measured methodical, unhurried. This was how correction happened when no one was trying to perform. He remembered the first courtroom vividly, the way his pulse had raced, the way every word felt like a trap. This time, his breathing was steady. He wasn't waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for closure. The door opened. His attorney stepped out, nodding once. "It's done," she said. "The court acknowledged procedural harm. Restitution has been ordered. The revised settlement stands." Julian absorbed the words slowly. Restitution, not revenge. Acknowledgement, not apology. It was enough. The judge's written opinion followed days later. It was precise, unemotional, and quietly damning. It detailed how undisclosed conflicts had compromised fairness, how timelines had been manipulated, how one party's ability to respond had been materially limited. Julian read it once, then filed it away. He didn't need to revisit the pain to validate the outcome. Marcus Hale's consequences were finalized shortly after. His license was suspended indefinitely. Appeals were denied. The professional persona he had built, authority, confidence, certainty, collapsed under scrutiny. Without credentials, without trust, there was nothing left to leverage. Julian heard about it through a third party. A former associate mentioned Marcus was taking time away, a phrase that barely concealed the truth. Julian felt no satisfaction, just inevitability. Evelyn's reckoning was quieter. Without Marcus's guidance, she faced the systems she had once leaned on, unprepared. Advisors withdrew. Opportunities evaporated. The settlement adjustments left her financially constrained in ways she hadn't anticipated. Julian didn't watch closely. Her consequences were not his responsibility. What mattered was what came next. Julian moved fully into his new life, not dramatically, but deliberately. He established long-term structures for his assets, ensuring redundancy and discretion. He diversified governance, appointed independent oversight, and documented contingencies. He would never be vulnerable in the same way again. Professionally, he returned slowly, not to the spotlight, but to the work. He consulted on projects that valued discipline over speed, sustainability over scale. People sought him out not because of his past success, but because of his clarity. He asked difficult questions. He refused rushed decisions. He walked away when alignment wasn't present. That reputation spread quietly. Julian found satisfaction in that quiet. One afternoon, months after the final ruling, Julian received a handwritten letter. It was from a junior attorney who had attended Marcus's ethics hearing. She wrote not to praise Julian, but to thank him. To say that the case had changed how she viewed advocacy, how easily systems could be manipulated, and how important it was to protect process as much as outcome. Julian read the letter twice. That, he realized, was justice's echo. Not punishment, but prevention. He framed the letter and placed it on a shelf beside the photograph of his grandfather. The two objects belonged together, evidence of preparation meeting consequence. Julian visited the small brick building one final time, not out of necessity, but gratitude. He stood across the street watching people pass without noticing it. The building didn't look special. That was the point. He whispered a thank you to the man who had taught him that the most valuable things often survived because they were ignored. As Julian walked away, he felt no desire to look back. The story had completed its arc. What followed wasn't triumph or loss. It was balance. Julian understood now that justice wasn't about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about restoring agency, his ability to choose how he lived, who he trusted, and what he valued. He chose peace. He chose patience. He chose a life that didn't need validation from systems that once failed him. And in making those choices, Julian realized something profound. He had not survived betrayal to become harder. He had survived it to become clearer. Some betrayals don't just take your money, they take your sense of reality. They make you doubt your instincts, your memories, even your worth. But this story reminds us of something deeper and far more powerful. Losing everything visible does not mean losing everything that matters. Strength isn't always loud. Justice isn't always immediate. And survival doesn't always look like winning at first. Sometimes the greatest advantage is patience. The courage to stay silent while you rebuild. The wisdom to let truth surface on its own time. And the humility to learn from pain instead of being defined by it. What was hidden here wasn't just an account, it was preparation legacy and the reminder that integrity, once reclaimed, becomes unbreakable. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part impacted you the most? Share your reflection in the comments below. And if you believe in stories about resilience, justice, and quiet strength, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more powerful journeys ahead.